Thank you for joining our webinar titled Your Small Business Post-COVID-19. As we all know, the coronavirus pandemic has had a profound impact on our economy, particularly small businesses. According to a report by the consulting agency McKinsey, 30 million small business jobs are vulnerable due to the pandemic. This is a much larger share than the larger private sector jobs. Before COVID, small businesses provided nearly half of the US private sector jobs. We recognize the importance of small business and that small business is the heart of the US economy, which is why the four of us believe this webinar to be so important. So, in order to help your small business continue to flourish post-pandemic, we've put together a panel of 4 experts on finances, accounting, legal matters, and marketing. So we'll start by introducing ourselves. My name is Maggie Johndrow. I'm a financial advisor and partner with Johndrow Wealth Management. Our headquarters are in Farmington, Connecticut, though we do serve clients across the United States with additional particular hubs in New York, Boston, and Florida. I started my career at the Wall Street Banks, Barclays, and JP Morgan in New York City, and then I moved over to the independent financial advisory role at Johndrow Wealth Management. I have a master's degree from the London School of Economics. I am a fiduciary, and I bring 10 years of experience to the role in helping individuals and their families with financial planning and investment matters. And many of those individuals also are small business owners, so I help with those planning needs. Next, I'll turn it over to Tessa.
Thank you, Maggie. My name is Tessa Jordan. I'm a licensed CPA in the state of Connecticut, and I've worked with small business owners for over 15 years now, handling everything from bookkeeping, payroll, to tax planning, tax return preparation, all the way up to financial statement services. So I'm happy to be on this webinar discussing how COVID-19 incentive programs can really benefit small business owners.
Kristen?
Hi, can you hear me? Yes, hi, sorry about that. My name is Kristen Center. I'm a corporate law attorney. I work with the law offices of Berkowitz, Traeger & Traeger, which is based in Westport, Connecticut. We also have a law office in New York City. I particularly specialize in mergers and acquisitions, debt finance matters, and general corporate work. My primary clientele includes startups and mid-sized to large companies, both in the nonprofit sector space and in the private sector space. Thanks.
Good morning, I'm Lindsay Jensen. I am the owner of Ryan Marketing Partners in West Hartford, Connecticut. We are a marketing agency that works with small, medium, large size businesses based on their marketing needs. We're a full service agency that started in 1996 by my father. We love to work with family owned businesses and businesses of any size based on whatever their needs may be. Thanks.
All right, so now that you've met our team of experts, we'll show you the agenda. We will be going in the order of finances, accounting, legal, and marketing. Any questions, we do ask you to email us. Our information will be flashing at the end of the presentation. We are here to help you move through this time. So let's start with finances. We have to begin any discussion of the economy and the markets with an update on the health pandemic. You might ask why? Well, because prior to COVID-19 reaching US shores, the US economy was actually doing quite well. Retail sales and automobile sales had reached record highs at the start of the year. New housing starts were back to pre-2008 levels, and unemployment had reached 3.5%, which is a record low. Many economists would argue that this recession was not caused by underlying financial issues with the fundamentals, but rather by an unexpected event, which is the global health crisis that caused our economy to temporarily shut down. This is very different than the recession of 2008, where there were actual underlying fundamental issues facing our economy. So we can make the argument that once COVID-19 is under control and businesses can reopen, the economy should also experience a significant comeback. So where are we in regards to containing COVID-19? As you can see here, this shows the new case percentage increase over time, starting in April through May. And you'll see that the US cases are represented by the blue line, and the orange line represents global cases. And what's most important to note here is that we're seeing a downward trajectory, which is great news. This graph comes from the US Employment and Training Administration, and you can see that in March of 2020, these were the initial unemployment claims. Yes, of course, there was a spike, but again, really good news is that now we see those initial new unemployment claims on a downward trajectory. These are both two of many positive data points that we've been following. As my Chief Investment Officer, Brad McMillan, likes to say, the sheer fact that we're discussing how to reopen the economy and we're actually taking measured steps to reopen that economy is a very good sign. This is something that we wouldn't have seen back in March. So you might ask yourself why the stock market has been increasing over the last 2 months after a deep downturn in March, while the US economy is still primarily shut down and people are still unemployed. One of the reasons has to do with the data points I just discussed. The market is forward-looking. It already priced in some negative events that have occurred. Business closures, unemployment, and hospitalizations have all been expected the moment that the market shut down back in March. So when we hear those numbers, it's not unexpected by the market and it doesn't react as sharply as it did in March. Now, if we were to see another closure of business, if we were to see a significant increase in spikes of cases, or if the virus were to mutate and be even more infectious, we would expect the market to react negatively again. But a second reason that the market continues to increase while the economy is still in a recession has to do with the CARES Act, which is the $2 trillion stimulus package passed by Congress back in March. The stimulus package was 3 times the size of the one passed during the 2008 recession. It was also passed much faster, in just a matter of weeks, whereas the package in 2008 took months to pass. Lastly, it was much more Main Street focused rather than Wall Street. And what I mean by this is that if you remember back in 2008, when we say it was Wall Street focused, the big banks were bailed out. And many critics believe there was not enough done to help individuals and small businesses. That is not the case today, as you can see in this chart, which is provided from NPR. You can see that the individuals and small business circles and the amount of billions provided to both of those is bigger than big corporations. So today we'll briefly talk about how the CARES Act affects small businesses for the purpose of this webinar. So first and foremost, it provided emergency grants, $10 billion of grants up to $10,000 per business to cover immediate operating costs. Then there were forgivable loans provided up to $350 billion for the Small Business Administration, and each business could get up to $10 million in loans. And Tessa will be walking us through these forgivable loans in her part of the presentation. There was relief for existing loans. So if you were a small business already using an SBA loan, there was $17 billion additionally provided to cover an additional 6 months of payments. And lastly, there were some significant 401k updates and or changes that you can implement as an employer. And I'll end my part of the presentation specifically talking about these. So let's first talk about the markets and whether you should be investing or not. So many small business owners that I work with have 3 buckets for their operating costs. Their short-term costs, which of course are anything from the next 6 months to a year to maybe even 2 years. That money tends to be held in savings checkings and maybe a high-yield savings account, which I would highly recommend. And if you're unsure of what that is, please reach out to me. Their medium-term bucket typically is 5 to 10 years, and that money tends to be invested. And then, of course, many businesses have their retirement funds, which is long-term savings as an employer. So this slide I love because it reminds us to not rely on the headlines in the media for an all clear to invest. So if you were to look here, we had a hypothetical $1 million investment that was put into the market in 2009, right after the last recession. And we're just looking at a snapshot of just 2 years in the market. This blue line shows the S&P 500, which is one of the indices that we use to indicate how the market's going. And in just 2 years, you can see that this investor would have had a cumulative 111% return. However, if this investor had waited to rely on headlines for an all clear to invest, they probably would have missed out on this 2 years. Look at some of the headlines. 663,000 jobs lost in March, total tops 5 million. Jobs report highlights shaky US recovery. Dow 5,000, there's a case for it. These are all very similar headlines to what we're hearing now. And you can see they were still happening at the early part of the recovery. So don't wait until the headlines are rosy to invest, because often that's too late. In fact, I believe that every person should be a long-term investor and not try to make short-term moves based on the volatility we're seeing in the market. If this makes you weary, I want to share this statistic with you. In any 10-year investing period, so if you were to look at any 10 consecutive years throughout history, the probability that stocks have an absolute negative return over those 10-year periods is only 1%. And I use bears here because bears are downward declining markets, whereas bulls are upward trending markets. But put in another way, if we looked at any 10-year investing period, the probability that stocks would have an absolute positive return is 99%. So again, there is, of course, always risk with investing in the stock market. However, over the course of any 10-year period in history, the probability that you would have an absolute negative return is only 1%, which is why it's so important to remain invested and be a long-term investor, even during times of volatility. You can see, this is one of my favorite charts to use. You can see all of the different crises that our economy and our world has faced by the covers of these Time magazines. It starts with the Great Depression, which is Black Tuesday, brings us through various wars, presidential impeachment, and all the way through 2008 recession. And this black line represents the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is one of the several indices we use to understand what the market's doing. And what you can see is that this road is certainly bumpy, but it is upward. It has an upward trajectory. So despite these bad things happen and they feel very terrible at the time, and the market certainly reacts, again, the long-term investor is rewarded here because over time, we would still expect the market to increase. The last point I'll make on the markets is that often after the worst of storms, we see the best of rainbows, right, in real life. And that's true of the markets as well. Historically, when we look at the worst days in the markets, within 2 to 3 weeks, we tend to see some of the best times in the markets. And that happened this time as well. On March 16th, we saw the one worst day drop in the market since the Great Depression. And then just 2 weeks later, you can see on March 27th, 2020, and on April 9th, 2020, those were two of the best weeks in the market ever. This chart is showing the 10 best weeks for the Dow Jones Industrial Average of all time. And you can see that those 2 weeks following that really terrible drop this past March are in those top 10. So again, those that remained invested certainly reaped these benefits. So now that we're moving away from the markets, let's talk about specific steps that your business should take during COVID-19. So first and foremost, you want to conserve cash. Perhaps you had to use that emergency fund that you had built up, and that's okay. That's what it's there for. But now, as we reopen and your profits and revenues start increasing, be sure to put money back into that emergency fund and replenish it. Pay yourself first, meaning when you look at your weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly revenue each month, make sure you carve out a piece of that and refund your emergency fund. I always think that an emergency fund should at least have 3 months worth of operating expenses, but if you can, I would bring it to 6 months or even a year's worth of operating expenses. While we are cautiously optimistic about where the economy is going, there is a contentious election happening this fall, and some scientists are saying there might have to be a second lockdown due to a second wave of coronavirus. So you might have to be dipping into that emergency fund again, which is why it's so important to replenish it as we reopen. Second, you want to review your insurance policies. Many business owners might find that the coronavirus itself will not trigger insurance coverage. So every business should be looking really deeply into their insurance policies. Some one-page endorsements that are tucked into the back of your policy may dramatically change what sort of claims are covered or not covered by your policy. You want to keep an open communication with your carrier and maybe seek help from an insurance broker as well. What I've been told is that when in doubt, you should give notice to your carrier about any COVID-related losses. A failure to do so might result in waiver of coverage that you otherwise might have been able to have. You want to meticulously document both the cause and the amount for any loss. So for example, if a supplier says they need to back out of an agreement due to COVID-19, you want to ask significant follow-up questions and take really detailed notes. And lastly, you'll want to consult an attorney potentially who has experience negotiating with and litigating against carriers if needed. You want to stay updated on helpful government programs. And again, Tessa will lead us through some of those in her part of the presentation. You want to review contracts that would be difficult to continue. And Kristen will be leading us through some of that during her part of the presentation. And lastly, don't stick your head in the sand. You have a team of experts of 4 people here with you that are willing to help and help you stay informed. And you might even have your own experts that you've relied on during this time. Be in communication with them, give them a call, and try to tackle these problems as we move through COVID-19. So to end my part of the presentation, I want to talk about some frequently asked questions regarding COVID-19 for business owners and plan participants. So an important question is, if you found some loss of revenue and profit, could you reduce or suspend your contributions to a 401k plan? The short answer is yes, you can. A non-safe harbor plan, generally speaking, is easier to reduce or suspend non-safe harbor contributions. However, you do want to understand whether your employer contribution is discretionary or non-discretionary in nature. So contact your 401k plan provider and they should be able to help with that. A safe harbor 401k plan is a little bit trickier because you do need to make some specific requirements before you can suspend your matching or any other non-elective contributions. Furthermore, you also need to still be able to pass the ADP and the ACP testing at the end of the year, and you need to meet the top-heavy minimum contribution requirements. So for those that are familiar with this sort of plan, essentially you have testing done at the end of the year to make sure that the key leaders of the business, which tend to be the business owners and their family members, aren't the only ones taking advantage of the 401k plan. And that's where the matching really helps. So again, you want to be in deep contact with your financial advisor and 401k plan provider. Another question I received is whether you can pay your fees from the plan instead of the corporate bank account, if that's how you've been paying any 401k fees. Overall, again, the answer is yes, but you have to understand what types of fees are being paid by the plan. Administrative costs are the ones that can be passed down to the plan. You also want to be discussing this with your CPA, because at the end of last year, there was some new rules passed that made it actually a tax benefit for employers to pay the 401k fees as opposed to passing them down to their employees. So you just want to make sure that if you were to make that change, you're not drastically changing your taxes. If your company needs to lay people off, this can impact your 401k plan. So when there's 20% or more participants laid off in a year, and that could be a single group layoff or multiple group layoffs in a year. So when you reach that 20% number, you need to 100% vest the affected participants. This is what's called a partial plan termination. Furthermore, even if you don't meet that 20% threshold number, remember, when you lay someone off, they're no longer contributing to your 401k plan. So you have to be mindful of that testing at the end of the year that I mentioned. Most of the deadlines for 401ks are the same. The only deadlines that are really impacted by the tax extension to July 15th are really IRA accounts. So if you're a sole proprietor who has a SEP IRA, for example, then yes, that has been pushed out to July 15th to make contributions, but pretty much the deadlines remain the same for 401k plans. And lastly, the CARES Act made some significant changes to loosen the laws around distributions and loans. These are optional for you as an employer to provide your plan participants and your employees, but it is something that might be worthwhile to note and do, especially during hard times, and it might be something that your employees come and ask you about. So generally speaking, 401k plans do not have to be allowed to make loans or distributions, though they could. But if you are under 59 and a half years old and you take a distribution from your 401k plan, you will have to pay a 10% penalty along with taxes. Under the CARES Act, plan participants can take out up to $100,000 of their 401k plan if the plan allows it. Even if they are under 59 and a half years old, they will not suffer the typical 10% early withdrawal penalty. They will still owe taxes. However, if they repay that loan that they take from their 401k within 3 years from the distribution date, their tax bill will be reversed. So essentially, you're allowing your employees to take a tax-free loan from their 401k so long as they repay it within 3 years. The key here is, however, that the distribution needs to be a corona-related hardship distribution. The IRS has some loose guidelines as to what a coronavirus hardship entails. So you want to encourage your employees, if you do offer this to them, to speak with their CPA to make sure that they fall under those hardships, because that's who can take this sort of distribution from the 401k. So I'm going to stop there. There are many more points that I could make about the market and why it's acting the way it is, and about some considerations regarding financial planning for your small business. So if you have any questions on your 401k, on other retirement plans, if you'd like to create a personal or business financial plan, or any advice on investments, please don't hesitate to reach out. As I mentioned, all of our contact information will be at the end of this presentation. I always personally offer a free initial consultation to see if I could help you, so don't hesitate to reach out. On that note, I will pass it to Tessa. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. That was great. Let me switch screens here. Okay. Okay, so today I wanted to focus on PPP funding and what that is. So why I'm choosing to focus on that is I get a lot of questions from small business owners if they should apply for PPP, if they're eligible for PPP, and what they should be using it on for the forgivable piece. So my attention is going to be focused on that section today. And Maggie was talking about the CARES Act earlier, which we saw the PPP funding originally roll out through the CARES Act. Back in early April, small business owners were able to apply. So my slides incorporate on June 5th, The Flexibility Act was also put into place, which allows for more flexibility for this PPP funding. So all my slides are going to incorporate the new changes with the Flexibility Act, and then at the end of the presentation, I'll go into the specifics on what the Flexibility Act covers, and if you're covered under, if you got funding under the CARES Act versus the Flexibility Act. So what is PPP? It's a Paycheck Protection Program that the SBA rolled out to incentivize small business owners to keep workers on payroll during the COVID-19 pandemic. So the great thing about this program is the loan might be eligible for forgiveness. So certainly a piece of it should be forgivable, but if you're strategic enough, 100% of this loan could be forgivable. So there's a lot of different incentive programs for employers right now, and this is a great one that everyone should be looking into. So good news is there's still money left. So if you haven't applied for the PPP, you should certainly contact your CPA to advise you on if this is the best program for you. I hear a lot of questions from sole proprietors that don't have employees if they're eligible to apply, and the answer is yes. So your owner's draw that you take, even if you have no employees, is still considered to be part of the payroll costs that are eligible for the PPP program. If you've laid off some employees during this pandemic or your office has been shut down, you should still consider applying, and we'll get into some details on that. So how do you go about applying? So applications are accepted through your SBA approved lender. So I would recommend reaching out to your lender that you already have a relationship with. Most lenders are going to be SBA approved for this particular program. So you would apply through them. They would request certain information such as your 2019 tax return or payroll reports if you have employees. If you are not sure who is eligible to give this funding, there is a link on the slide for an SBA approved lenders if you're not already working with one. So now you've gotten the funds for the PPP, you've applied for it, gotten the funds. Now how do you use it? So when we talk about a covered period, we're going to look at 24 weeks. So within 24 weeks, if you use the loan proceeds for payroll costs and utility costs, you could have chances for this getting forgiven, and we'll go into more details about the forgivable piece. But what is a payroll cost? So payroll, you want to make sure that the funding that you receive, you use at least 60% for payroll. Payroll includes everything from salary, wages, commission, bonuses, or if you're a sole proprietor, it would be your own salary. That would all be considered a payroll cost. Now, if your employees make over $100,000, you're capped at $100,000. So if you pay someone $100,000 and you give them a bonus of $5,000 during this covered period, that $5,000 is not going to benefit you because they already make the $100,000 cap. So, you know, I'm not going to go into more specifics on that, but if you have questions, let me know on that. What else is considered payroll costs would be healthcare costs and retirement plan costs. So this is the employer portion only. So when we're talking healthcare costs, so that is if an employer is paying $1,000 to Anthem for their employees' health insurance and the employee contributes $500, your eligible payroll cost to utilize this loan would just be $500. And retirement plans, if you have not paid your 2019 safe harbor contribution that Maggie was touching upon earlier today, you can use the proceeds to pay for this retirement plan. Or if you're an employer who makes the retirement plan match as you go along each week when you're paying your employees, you can certainly use that as well. So another important point we want to touch on for eligible costs, you have to pay them throughout your covered period. So if you incur the cost but you don't pay them, then that probably wouldn't count. So there is some gray areas and a lot of guidance still needs to be rolled out on these programs, but that's the biggest umbrella for the payroll. Then we look at utility costs. So you can use up to 40% of the PPP funding that you receive on utility costs. So really, if we look at the umbrella of utility costs, what is covered under there? Well, if you're a small business and you rent a lease space for your building, that rent would be considered a utility cost if paid within the covered period. If you own the building and you have a mortgage on the building, the interest that you pay during that time of the covered period would be considered a utility cost. Then other utility costs would be your telephone, internet, transportation, and electricity. We get a lot of questions on what is considered transportation. Well, the guidance is very loose on that as well, but in simplistic terms, I would say if you're reimbursing your employees for mileage, it would be that cost, or if you're a contractor and you have a lot of fuel for your trucks and your equipment, that would be considered a transportation cost as well and be covered under that utility. So you can use 100% of the funds for payroll. You don't have to spend any on utility, but when you fill out the application, you're going to find that you might have some more utility costs than payroll, because during your covered period, your office might be closed. So, okay, so how is this loan forgiven? So we talked about using the proceeds for eligible expenses. That's very important. Then you want to maintain the same level of full-time equivalent employees. So when we talk about full-time equivalent employees, when you go to put in the application to see how much is forgiven, you have to declare how many full-time equivalent employees you had during before the pandemic hit. So they let you pick which period you want. So it could be February 15th, 2019 through June 30th, 2019. Or you can choose the period January 1st, 2020 through February 29th, 2020. And they look at a monthly average of full-time equivalent employees. So you want to choose the period that you've had the least amount of full-time equivalent employees, because when you're applying for this application and they're looking at the covered period of 24 weeks and say you have 2 full-time equivalent employees, but during the prior period when they're looking at a monthly average you had 4, that's going to limit your forgiveness on this loan. So if you have 2 full-time equivalent employees during the covered period and 2 before the pandemic hit, then you would be eligible for forgiveness on that piece. The second measurement for forgiveness is maintaining salary levels before the pandemic. So they allow you during the covered period to drop wages 25% with still getting the loan forgiven. If you drop your wages to employees more than 25%, a portion of this loan will not be forgiven. So if you think about it, that, you know, if you have somebody that's making $13 an hour before the pandemic hit, and then during the covered period of the 24 weeks, you're paying them $13, it would be forgiven. If you cut their wages down to 10, then a portion of that would lessen the forgiveness on this loan. Okay, so the changes with the Flexibility Act. So now you have up to 24 weeks to use the proceeds. So during the CARES Act, the original time frame was you had to use the proceeds within 8 weeks. But really, the SBA got a lot of pushback and the government got pushback because, as we know, a lot of small business owners were not eligible to be open because of state restrictions. So they've allowed 24 weeks. You can still use an 8-week time period and apply for forgiveness after 8 weeks, or you can choose the 24-week period. So you want to make sure that you're very strategic and you think about your payroll and your utility costs during an 8-week period versus 24-week period to get the most forgiven. Payroll costs are now 60% of the proceeds, and the remaining 40% can be used on utility costs. And then recipients now have until December 31st, 2020 to restore full-time equivalents and salary levels. So when we talked about during the covered period maintaining your full-time equivalent and your salary levels, well, when you apply for forgiveness, you can choose the safe harbor election, which says, okay, well, my doors weren't open during the 24 or 8-week period. However, by December 31st, I've restored all my full-time equivalent employees, and I'm now paying them at the level I was before, prior to the pandemic. Then you are still eligible for forgiveness. So that's a great benefit. And then, so the 3 bullet points that I have to begin with, if you received your funding during the CARES Act before June 5th, when this Flexibility Act came into play, all these, the first 3 bullet points apply to your funding. This 4th bullet point, it's important to note that this is effective as of June 5th under the Flexibility Act. So if you are getting your funding June 5th or later, then you have 5 years to pay back the unforgivable piece at 1% interest. If you received your funding during the CARES Act before June 5th, then you have 2 years at 1% interest to pay back the loan. So this can be negotiated with the lender to extend it to 5 years if you were part of that earlier package under the CARES Act. So it is something that is negotiable, but you just want to make sure that you're talking to your lender when you apply for forgiveness. Another important aspect of the PPP is you must apply for forgiveness. If you do not apply by December 31st, then none of the loan is forgiven, and you have to pay it back over the 2 or 5 years at 1% interest. Applying for forgiveness, that is going to be through the lender that you were approved through in the first place, and they're going to ask for documentation on proof that you paid these expenses during your covered period. So you're going to have to fill out an application, select either your 8-week period, 24-week period, measure your full-time equivalent employees, check your salary levels per employee during your covered period, and then the SBA and the lender are going to work together to come up with a forgivable piece to determine how much you have to pay back from the loan. So all in all, this is a great program. One other point I want to touch on that I didn't put in the slide is whatever forgivable piece of this loan that you have, it is not considered taxable income. However, the expenses that you use during the covered period that are forgiven, so if that's $10,000 in payroll and $5,000 in utilities, you cannot use those as a business deduction for tax purposes at the end of the year. So when you're doing your tax planning or thinking about it, you really want to make sure in the back of your mind, you know that $15,000 of that forgivable loan, you're not going to be able to claim those eligible expenses on your tax return. So I know there's a lot of gray area to this. A lot of the information is changing. So if you have any further questions, or you just want to dive deeper into it, or you need someone to analyze if you should be applying for the loan or how to get the most strategic benefit out of the forgivable piece, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is in the slides, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Tessa. That was great. Okay, let me switch slides here. Okay, so diving right into the legal portion of this presentation, if you were to ask me what legal questions have I been fielding lately during COVID-19, and what questions have been keeping me and my clients up at night, my overwhelming response would be employment. By far and away, most of the questions I've been fielding are employment related. One of the more pressing and popular questions are, what options do employers have if mandatory lockdowns have caused their businesses to suffer? Can they make job cuts in order to lower labor costs, operating expenses, which tend to be very expensive? Another popular question is, what are the new laws that are related to COVID-19 that have been enacted? And how will those new laws help small businesses that are flailing? And I'll touch on each of those questions and flesh them out during my presentation. But before I dive right into the materials, I really want to note that the laws and guidelines and regulations that are focused on addressing COVID-19 issues are really constantly changing on a week-to-week basis, even on a day-to-day basis. Many are state-specific and even industry-specific. So for the sake of time, I'll only be focusing on the new federal laws that are impacted by COVID-19 and the Connecticut laws. So one big employment-related issue that I often receive is what do I do as an employer if I'm strapped for cash and I no longer can afford to keep certain employees on payroll? What can I do? What are my options? And the more obvious options are to either terminate employees or furlough them. So I'm just going to touch on the important distinctions between furloughs and layoffs. So furloughs in the most general sense are defined as temporary leaves of absence. Furlough employees are, number one, not paid for their time worked. 2, they remain employed, and 3, maintain benefit eligibility, but that's of course subject to the terms of the employer's benefit plans. And compensating furloughed employees can be tricky, keep this in mind. The legal ramifications for furloughed employees really depends on whether the employees are non-exempt or exempt. And put simply, non-exempt employees are employees who receive overtime, they don't receive a salary, and they're paid by the hour. Exempt employees do receive a salary and do not receive overtime. Non-exempt employees can typically be furloughed, and employers can reduce their hours on a day-to-day basis, a weekly basis, just depending on how the market's going and how their business is operating. But they have to be paid for actual work performed, and this includes overtime. Now, actual time performed is kind of a legal term of art. It includes any work-related communications, and this can be something as small as monitoring emails and employee checking voicemails, which can be really hard to monitor from an employer standpoint, particularly if these employees are working remotely. Exempt employees, again, these are salaried employees, can also be furloughed. However, under federal laws and most state laws, and this includes Connecticut, exempt employees are entitled to their same weekly salaries for any work week in which the employee performs any work, regardless of the number of hours worked. So for example, and this might seem extreme, but it's realistic, if an employee works for just 1 hour a week and then doesn't work the remainder of the week, she is entitled to her full week of salary, even if the work done is without the employee's consent. So on the flip side of furloughs, which are temporary, are layoffs, which are more permanent. Laid off employees or terminated employees typically, 1, lose their eligibility under employee benefit plans after a certain period of time, and are 2, they no longer remain employed by the employer, and it takes effect immediately. A big pro for an employer is that the employer no longer has to pay employee benefits if the employer offers them to her employees. That's a very quick way to cut labor costs. And number 2, another pro is they don't have to pay salary for exempt employees. A con is if you terminate employees, that might trigger final pay obligations. So when I say final pay obligations, I mean any accrued and unpaid sick leave, vacation time, paid time off that an employee is entitled to. Those could be expensive costs and even may include severance under an employment contract, for example. And 2, the employer is going to have to rehire new employees when business is better and when this pandemic turns around, and recruiting costs can be very expensive and time consuming. So if you're an employer, and even if you have 1 employee or 2 employees, or you have 500 employees and you're considering whether you want to implement a furlough policy or terminate employees, I have 4 attorney tips laid out here that I'll run through quickly. Attorney tip number 1 is really consider implementing a furlough policy. Like I said before, it's very hard to monitor when employees work and what they're doing during a furlough, particularly if they're working remotely from home. So one thing you can do is have an employer have your employees or furloughed employees acknowledge a furlough policy by actually signing it and clearly setting out company expectations. So for example, requiring exempt employees to obtain prior supervisory approval in advance of any time worked, or non-exempt employees to get any kind of overtime worked approved. Tip number 2 is just be mindful of the duration of the furlough, particularly if it's long-term or indefinite. Some states may actually treat it by default as a layoff, which can trigger those final pay obligations that I talked about earlier, which could be very expensive. 3, look at your employment agreements and your company policies to see if employers have any contract rights if they're furloughed or terminated, or if their hours go down at all. And number 4, be careful not to discriminate. This is a popular topic that you'll see a lot in the news today. Whatever course of action you ultimately decide to take, If the decision proportionally impacts only a subset of your employees, you as an employer could run afoul of federal and state laws that are designed to protect against discrimination, one being the Americans with Disability Act. So flipping to unemployment benefits during a furlough or a layoff. Regardless of whether you decide to furlough or lay off employees, as an employer, you should really focus on getting smart on your state's unemployment laws so you can really educate your employees of their rights to receive unemployment benefits if they're entitled to them. Unemployment laws are very state specific. Some states, including Connecticut, require employees to continue to look for work during unemployment. In Connecticut recently, actually, the state waived this work search requirement. Some other states, including New York, have a waiting period before benefits are provided. This waiting period has recently been waived as well. So unemployed employees can receive benefits immediately. The good news is that under the new Federal CARES Act, some states are able to give even more unemployment benefit protections to their employees. We call these, beefed up unemployment benefits, and Maggie had touched on this earlier. Employees can receive up to an additional $600 a week, and benefits can be extended up to 13 weeks. One thing I want to note is that these quote unquote beefed up benefits really are only expected to extend through the end of July, and it's up in the air whether Congress will extend the stimulus package. Other considerations and alternatives to furloughs and layoffs. Number one, a shared work program. In the most general sense, under a shared work program, employees are allowed to reduce their hours. In Connecticut's even by as much as 60%, which is pretty significant. And employees can collect partial unemployment benefits to replace a portion of those lost wages. A big pro for employers under shared work programs is that the program may have less impact on employers' unemployment taxes than a full layoff. And a big pro for employees is that employees who would otherwise not be eligible to collect unemployment benefits, for example, because they don't meet the maximum eligibility requirements to receive benefits under normal unemployment insurance, would become eligible to collect partial unemployment benefits. So that could be a huge help. Another alternative is mandatory use of accrued unused vacation time or paid time off. This is not as great of an alternative because it's very temporary and it doesn't fix all labor related and labor cost issues, because employers have to continue to pay their employees regular rates after they come back from leave. So it's not a great final solution. And also under the new Federal Families First Coronavirus Response Act, employers can't require use of vacation leave or personal time off if an employee takes leave under the act. And just to touch on this new law, also dubbed the FFCRA, I want to touch on this because it covers employers that have fewer than 500 workers, which can include a lot of startups and small businesses. What it does is it expands the protections under the family medical leave by creating paid and sick leave provisions for employees affected by COVID-19. It can provide up to 80 weeks of paid leave, an additional 12 weeks of leave, and could also give employers, including self-employed business owners, corresponding tax credits. Going to the second part of my legal presentation, I want to talk about some precautions that employers should take when they're considering bringing employees back into their offices, back into the workforce. What legal things they should keep in mind, what things they have to do, what things they shouldn't be doing. For the sake of time, I can't touch on all 5 of these questions, but I'll touch on 2 or 3. And the first one I want to touch on is, can I take an employee's temperature at work? Some daycares and schools are already starting to require this of parents when they drop off their kids. The simple answer is yes, but as an employer, you should be really mindful of any applicable privacy laws and be careful not to discriminate. Also be careful as to how and whether you inquire about your employee's medical status so you don't run afoul of the ADA and the EEOC restrictions. It's always a good idea to give employees advance notice before taking their temperature or collecting any information about them. Send them an email, put up notices on your premises, anything you can do to make them aware that this is happening. The second question I want to talk about is, can employees refuse to come back to work out of fear of contracting the virus? Totally relevant and legitimate question. The quick answer is maybe, but probably not. Under the Occupational Safety and Health Administration standards, OSHA, employers are required to provide their workers only with a safe workplace, and an employee can only refuse if she thinks she's in imminent danger of death or serious bodily harm, which is a very steep hurdle to pass. You might be able to trigger this threshold if, for example, an employee is required to travel to a hot zone, or her employee is requiring her to work without protective gear. But by far, most work environments would not rise to this level. So an employee's fear factor would probably not be an acceptable excuse for going back to work. And if she doesn't return, it could be potentially grounds for termination, depending on her employer's policy. The last question I want to touch on is, how can I accommodate employees with children who are out of school? A lot of parents are struggling, their kids are out of school, daycares are closed, and employers want to help, particularly if they really need their employees to come back to work while their kids are still at home. What I would say is you should not allow your employees to bring their kids to work or open up kid zones, which a lot of people are starting to talk about, which are, just rooms with toys and treats that employees can drop their kids off, and it essentially becomes somewhat of a daycare. Don't do it. I mean, this really puts your business at risk of being considered a daycare under state laws, and daycares require state licenses and are very highly regulated by state agencies. So don't put your business at risk of being treated like a daycare. What you can do and what you should do for employee morale, and just from a good business standpoint, is to allow your employees to parent their kids. If they're working remotely, allow them to adjust their schedules around their kids, allow them to call during off hours, be patient, allow kid sounds to be in the background, allow them to have them sit on their laps during Zoom calls, and just acknowledge that they're parents as well as professionals. And that's the best piece of advice I can give from that standpoint. So there are a couple more questions here that I'd love to touch on, and many, many more legal issues that we could flesh out. But for the sake of time, I'm going to end here. But I will say, if you have any questions related to your contracts, real estates, employment questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is at the end of the presentation, and I would be happy to help.
Thanks so much, Kristen. Here we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I consider to be the fun part. We've got your investments, your accounting, your legal, everything is now in place, or hopefully we've helped you a bit to this point. And now want to start to talk about how to get your message out there and start building your business. So today I've put together a 3-step plan to market both during and after COVID-19. We obviously don't know when this is going to end entirely, but we see a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. So we want to talk about what you should be doing now and what you should be thinking about doing, hopefully in the near future. So I titled this Building Bridges because I truly think that we are building a bridge from what was the norm to what the new norm is going to be. I don't see us going backwards, so I really think that it's important that we look at what we have in place now and decide what we're going to need in the future for that new norm. So we've created 3 different categories: pivot, audit, and build. So under pivot, some of these things you may have already done, and if you haven't, now's a great time to think about them. How can you add value to your clients right now? So the services and offerings that you may have been providing for years may have adjusted in the last 12 weeks. And those needs are going to continue to evolve for your customers. So really think about what is the added value that you can bring to your clients. Renegotiate any existing media contracts. If you have a billboard contract, the last 12 weeks was probably not the best time to be running ads on billboards, as commuters are commuting much less than they were before. If you were running ads on gas station pumps, again, not a great time. I think I filled up my gas tank once in the last 3 months. So think about what media contracts you're already in, what can you push off, and what can you renegotiate to really focus some of those dollars elsewhere. Another great thing to consider right now is reconsider what your goals are. So obviously all of our goals as small business owners is to sell. But right now selling isn't necessarily the easiest to do while people are trying to manage their own businesses. So reconsider what some of your goals are and adjust them, whether it's earning new likes on social media or gaining web leads and building your database. As you are growing an audience right now, you'll have more people to speak to when it's time for the world to open and people are ready to make those sales decisions. Another thing to think about is changing your messaging based on this current climate. So the current climate has continued to evolve over the last 12 weeks, and you want to make sure that what you wrote on your website, your email, your social media 12 weeks ago has been adjusted to accommodate phase 1 opening, phase 2 opening, which is today in Connecticut, and really make sure that you're adjusting your messaging and that you didn't just set it and forget it. And lastly, under pivoting is making sure you're updating those home pages, your cover images, your hours, your business hours, contact info. If you've had everyone forwarding calls to their cell phone, if you have mail forwarding from your office back to your home, think about all those adjustments that you made 12 weeks ago and make sure to update all of those pieces. That then brings us into the build, which is supposed to be the exciting part of this, is building our businesses back up again. So now's a great time before we ramp up to really think about where we want to be on the other side of this. What kind of a company do you want to be? My business has been around for 23 years. My father started it back in 1996. And we're really thinking about what kind of agency we want to be in the future. What are our goals? What are our missions? What's our values? What kind of culture do we want? Similar to what Kristen was talking about of being flexible with parents, allowing some of that working from home to make sure everybody on your team is comfortable. And what kind of an organization do you want to be for your customers? Within building, now is a great time to strengthen your relationships with your current clients and your vendors. Although they might not be ready to buy, they are definitely looking for someone to help guide them right now. So if you are there for your customer now, they will be there for you long term. What skill sets do you want your team to have and how can they learn them now? Again, downtime is a great time to think about what are some of the things that you wish your team had in place from a skills level, and make some of those, carve out some time for them to build on those skills. Again, before the world starts to ramp up and open up, use some of this downtime to build on some of the skill sets available on your team, whether it's you want to understand more about social media, you want to understand more about Google AdWords, have someone on your team dedicate some time to advancing your skills. Then really consider, are there any new products and services offerings that you want to now offer moving forward? So in our world as a full service agency, we do everything from web design to public relations to crisis management and graphic design. So really thinking about over the last 12 weeks, we have done a ton in terms of digital and creating video for our clients. Most content is being absorbed online right now. So we've offered far more video content than we probably have over the last 20-something years. So thinking about how have you helped your clients over the last 12 weeks and really implement that into the menu of services you offer them moving forward. And finally, be a resource to your clients. Everybody needs that piece of feeling like someone is there for them. If you can be there for your clients right now, it's certainly going to build that loyalty long term. And the final piece is audit. So right now is a great time to audit what you have for marketing tools and make sure that it all is in line with who you are and who you want to be. So take a look at your website. If you launched your website in 2015 and you haven't reviewed your content since then, take the time to look at what your content says and make sure it's actually reflective of who you are. If you're not a believer in email blasts, please call me so I can argue the opposite direction. But email blasts and newsletters have never been more important. It's a great communication tool, and it allows you to be a resource for your customer. Social media, whether or not you are posting once a month, once a week, or once a day, you should use that as a platform to keep in touch with your customers. Do a quick audit, see what kind of, if somebody scrolled through your entire news feed, what would the sense they would get about your company. Now is also a great time to build out your onboarding processes and training guides. A lot of us aren't in growth mode right now, but will be hopefully in the near future. So take some of this time to consider what your onboarding process is, building out training guides so that when you do start hiring, you have some of those pieces ready to go. Case studies and portfolio of work updates. Again, if you'd launched your website in 2015 and you haven't updated it with any of your success stories, case studies, or portfolio pieces, take the time to update those pieces now so that when you are in growth mode, somebody's going to land on your site and clearly see the successes that you've had. And then audit what may have been planned at the beginning of the year in 2020. You created your traditional marketing strategies and your digital marketing strategies. Those may no longer make sense. So really take a look at where you had planned for some of your dollars to go and where they should be moving to in the future. The nice thing about digital is it's going to allow you to bob and weave based on what the economy is doing and what your sales cycle is doing. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of those digital marketing strategies today. So amongst digital marketing, the number one thing to do is stay active. A lack of visibility right now can make customers think you've closed for good. There are so many businesses that are unfortunately going to be withdrawing from the market that you want to make sure that you are active and have a presence. In addition to that, as phase 2 starts to open up here in Connecticut, there's going to be a lot of noise out there. Everybody is going to send an email blast that says they are now open. Everybody is going to post on social media that they are now servicing their customers. So you need to cut through that noise. And the number one way of doing that is going to be staying active. Also, building those relationships and connections. Social media is one of the best ways to do that. You can answer questions, you can be a resource of information, you can give tips to your clients, little nuggets of information that makes you top of mind with your customers. And really think about how you can help them out. So consumers are expected to become more loyal to brands and businesses that have helped them out. They'll remember how you treated them during this time. So if you're not there for them, they're not going to hold it against you, but here's a great opportunity for you to be there for your customer and build that long-term loyalty. And last is creating engaging content. So support your customers, inform your customers, engage your customers. You can do that through, as we said, social media, email blasts, video content, create tutorials on how to either use your product or your services, but create content that is helpful to them. So 3 quick tips that you can do yourself without necessarily including a marketing expert is to review your copy and your content. So not all ad copy is going to hold relevance after COVID-19. Review your copy, review what lives on your website, what lives in your email blast, what lives in your printed collateral material, and make sure that the existing messages won't include anything that's going to be considered insensitive. In addition, look to see what your competitors are saying and doing. As I said, there's going to be a lot of noise out there and you really need to cut through it. In order to cut through it, you need to know what that noise is. So take a look at what your competitors are doing, how they're saying it, and what promotions or discounts they may be offering. And lastly, under copy and content is what does your customer need now, and is it clear that you can provide that solution? It is the worst thing for any of us to hear, I didn't know you did that and I went to somebody else. So make sure that your copy reflects who you are, what you do, and that it clearly answers the question that your customer may have on whether or not you can offer that to them. Keywords is a great piece, both from a search engine optimization, the keywords that are built into your website, in addition to just the language that you're using day to day with your customers or potential customers as you're trying to earn new business. Reviewing what your keywords are, adapting them, and monitoring them. understand how your customer is searching for your services online, and then adapt and monitor some of those search trends. So a great tool on search trends is to use a tool by Google called Google Trends, which allows you to plug in different words to see how they are being served to somebody searching for you or a service you provide. So here, for an example, we have 4 different ways of saying daycare providers. In blue, daycare is 1 word. In red, daycare is 2 words. Yellow, childcare 1 word. Green, childcare 2 words. We have a customer who has been working with Ryan Marketing for the last couple of years. They have been building daycare facilities throughout the state of Connecticut. We really needed to know, how are people searching for them? So we put in the top 4 ways that somebody might search. You'll see below that in the blue line, daycare as 1 word is far more searched within the state of Connecticut over the last 12 months than what is in yellow, which is childcare as 1 word. So doesn't mean that we won't use all of these keywords when we're building somebody's website, but it's really good to know what the most common way is somebody's searching for you. Google Trends allows you to do that. And the last piece of that you can consider using intel that will help you as you're building your business and where to put your dollars from a marketing standpoint is think about device strategy. So monitor your client's behavior using another great tool by Google, Google Analytics. Most of your websites should have been built with Google Analytics. It's a free tool. If you've built a site in the last few years, I'd have to assume that it's already there. If it's not, certainly give me a call and I can talk to you about how to find it, and if it's not there, how we can add it to your site. But Google Analytics is going to show you that reporting of who your customers are, where they're coming from, and when they get to your site, where they're going. One piece to consider over the next couple of months is how your customer is searching for you. Are they searching from a mobile device or laptop and desktop? And when you're determining where you want to put dollars behind, you may find that over the last 12 weeks, mobile usage is down on your website because customers are no longer sitting in lobbies waiting for their next appointment, scrolling online. They're not sitting on the train commuting, scrolling online, and they're sitting on their laptops or desktops. So you really want to determine what your client's behavior is when they're using Google searches, and then adjust your digital campaign or pay-per-click campaigns accordingly. And it will help you determine, as you are readjusting your budget dollars, where your dollars should be. So I'm going to end with the best way through uncharted waters is forward. We know that there's a lot of information out there, and that there is a new norm coming up, and that we are all kind of in this together. So we definitely want to encourage you to keep moving forward, and we are excited to build with all of you.
Thank you everyone for phenomenal presentations. You can see all of our contact information on this page. As we mentioned, we are all available to help you move through this challenging time, and we're excited to see the small businesses reopen. We'll just end this presentation by saying, please email us your questions. As we mentioned, we are taking them by email for the sake of time. And then at the end, there will be a brief disclosure flashed. But again, thank you for joining us. Thank you to our speakers, and we look forward to speaking with you.